All right, I said I wanted to start with a whiteboard just orienting us to relational databases. I typically start by, and my drawing skills aren't great, but they can be effective in terms of whiteboard communicating. Drawing a cylinder, right? This is typically what is drawn to represent a database or the acronym DB. Specifically, it's meant to represent a relational database or a SQL database. These days there are alternatives, like you might hear about a no SQL database. That's not, typically we don't even draw those with cylinders. We draw those with possibly hexagon things. Now I'm way out of my element, wasting everybody's time here. But typically, no SQL database is drawn with something like a cylinder, but not quite a cylinder. So there I did that. But we're talking about relational databases. I like to go to a lighter color here. Examples of relational databases. Microsoft has a relational database called SQL Server. There's a very popular open source relational database called Postgres. Another popular open source database is MySQL. Right? Which is currently kind of administered as an open source database by the company Oracle, but they also have a large scale, large enterprise Oracle relational database. Many others, right? Lots of relational databases out there. Many of these things too will exist in the cloud. So I kind of like to zoom out a little bit here, and there we kind of saw what a relational database was. But if on the outside, if I try, and this is going to be a bad drawing, but if I try to draw the cloud, many times we think of our data as residing in the cloud, right? And then various users kind of access our data. Like I'm just going to draw a few users out here. I'll try to draw a web browser, which I'm not a great artist, but hopefully we can recognize this as a web browser, kind of with an address bar on it. In there, maybe I'll show a picture of a sunset, and maybe on the right there are like some comments about this picture, something like that. Well, that data, there's a chance that it could come from a relational database in the cloud. Like when you go to a certain URL, some request is made to the cloud. Typically that's running some programming language here, so I'm doing squirrely brackets to represent a programming language, but there's code statements within that programming language, and that programming language might write queries to get data out of a database, right? So here I'll use a highlight color. These are SQL queries. Again, written by some web developer to get the picture and the comments out of the database. Ultimately, it sends that all back and it displays on our screen, and kind of as an end user, we don't even know necessarily that there has been some SQL queries run behind. So that's one example of a database in a cloud. If I draw just one more, this could represent you and why you came here to this class. But sometimes we work for companies that have a large enterprise relational database, and they give us a tool. That tool could be SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio, which might be the tool I use against SQL Server. It might be Azure Data Studio. If I'm accessing relational databases or SQL Server in Azure, I can also point Azure Data Studio at Postgres. It might be my SQL Workbench or Oracle SQL Developer. And I'll just abbreviate that one. There are numerous other tools that we can use to connect to a database out in the cloud and write queries. So typically, and the one we use will have a window like this, but they have a window up above where we'll write a query in structured query language. It'll get sent out to the database. The database will execute that query and send back the results. And typically the results, kind of show up in some table below the query, right? So we can make changes to the query and press a play button. And again, it will go out. oops, and I hit the eraser there. I meant to hit the little highlighter, but it'll go out, run the query in the database, and give us back the results, right? So I hope this gives us an orientation of relational databases and why we write SQL queries. I guess I didn't write that these are also SQL queries here. So we're actually writing them in a tool that lets us execute that SQL directly, as opposed to, my first example was I'm just browsing a website and some web developer wrote the SQL queries. I guess there was one more picture that I kind of wanted to draw, and that's to make it easy for this class. We are not going to use a relational database in the cloud. We are going to just use our browsers. So I'm going to draw one more browser down here, right? And it's kind of one where we're going to write some queries up above and see some results down below, right? But it's going to connect up to a database that's running right in the browser, right? So, I don't even know how to draw that. Maybe if I draw a dashed line, that's a SQLite or a SQLite database that will run right within our browser. But the important thing is we'll be able to write SQL queries here, right? And this is what we'll primarily use to learn SQL query basics. And we won't have to connect up to a cloud or anything, so it makes it kind of easy. So that's all that I wanted to share in this video. We'll come back, and I think I'm going to do one more whiteboard video about a SQL query prior to actually loading up our tool of choice and using a SQLite database to write our first SQL query. So stay tuned for that. Thanks.